This week, for my tour of the National Park Service, let's take advantage of the season. This year, on the East Coast, it looks like fall is a little bit on hold, or at least the fall weather, even if the days are getting shorter. But just as soon as the temperature starts to drop, the chlorophyll is going to retreat from all those deciduous leaves, and then the hidden yellows, oranges, and reds will come out to shine. That's right, it's leaf peeping season. And while some of the best roads are all clogged up with cars, cozy cafes, and people sweating in their new fall sweaters, how is it 75 Fahrenheit in November in Philadelphia? This isn't good. But there are plenty of places full of trees because the East Coast, despite all those cities and the people living there, is surprisingly full of trees. And one place to go look at leaves as they go through their changes lets you walk and look at the leaves and can even provide some quiet for pondering the whole cosmological and biochemical wonder of the whole thing. And one place for all this pondering is the forest on Catoctin Mountain in the center of North Maryland. About an hour-and-a-half drive out of Baltimore and D.C., it's a nice mixture of short strolling trails and medium and longer hikes. From the slopes of Catoctin Mountain, you can look out over Raven Rock and Buzzard Knob, two peaks crossed by the Appalachian Trail. While this area was once home to a number of majestic large trees, these were done in by lumbering, homesteading, reckless nut harvesting, and the infamous chestnut blight over the years. Now, since then, the remoteness of the area and national park stewardship has allowed some new large trees to emerge, including the particularly tall tulip poplars. The Deerfield Nature Trail takes you through many sites in the park, including traces of colonial habitation and industry. And a number of these things will sound familiar if you've been listening through the podcast, including a stand that were coppiced for a local charcoal industry, a dry stone wall, and sugar maples. You'll also get to see the process of forest succession in its gradual progress as the slowest growing mature hardwoods return to the area. So for a chance to look at some lovely leaves in a quiet spot and bathe in a little history at the same time, take a trip out to Catoctin Mountain Park, right up there at the north edge of Maryland. Episode 133, Stew. A history including etymology, techniques, and what it was called before. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week is one of those weeks where I started looking a little deeper and realized there's way more to this than I thought. So before we can talk about the 19th century state of stew and where it was, it turns out a deeper dive into the what and the how of stew is actually worthwhile. And hopefully I can address the question, soup or stew? And does it even matter? To answer all of these questions and more, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that stew is likely a bigger category than you ever thought, but the word is far newer than you would ever believe. And the differences between a good stew and, stew, yay, almost all happen at the beginning of the cooking process, and the rest happen right at the end. And the fact that all the action happens at the beginning and the end is what makes stew such a good food for days otherwise packed with other tasks. You can pretty much just let it take care of itself for most of the middle. So what was the question that got me in all of the trouble to begin with? It was the stew or soup question. Is there a meaningful difference and does it matter? Now, obviously, as a food historian, I was pretty sure that it mattered. But I hope once I get through the explanation, you might care at least a little as well. But far more important is that maybe it will help make all of your stews and braises and fricassees and many of the other slow-cooked dishes tastier on into the future. And possibly your soups as well. So, the word stew. A little bit like last episode in the baked beans, what it meant then and what it means now has definitely altered over time. I mean, especially from a history point of view, but also from just a semantics point of view. And from a history point of view, The change is where the interesting parts come in. With baked beans in the traditional recipe, the baking part was about getting flavor into the beans, not really about cooking them. That's what the overnight soak and the morning boil were for. It was only later, as double method cooking went out of style and canned beans became so ubiquitous, that beans stewed in a can became conflated with baked beans. Now wait, I just said the cooked in a can beans were stewed. So are they stew? Well, maybe. But don't worry, I'll still call them baked beans. I'm not trying to start another is a taco a sandwich type of problem here. What we call stew now, the thing, the noun, it got its name from the cooking method. And you can see it around. Stewed tomatoes, stewed apples, the phrase, stewing in your own juices. But from the time stew was introduced into the English language to the present, so many inept stews have happened that the word got a really poor reputation. As a result, we tend to use the word braise to mean pretty much the same thing. And then, well, for more, let me turn to my On Food and Cooking by Harold McGee to look into this more deeply. According to McGee, both stew and braise are words borrowed from the French. Étuve, or the root for stew, it means hot enclosure and shares roots with the fancy 18th century cooking appliance, the stew stove, which would go on and grow up into the Aga cooker, that quintessentially English appliance that was actually invented in Sweden. Anyway, while stew refers to the hot enclosure, the word braise shares roots with brazier, that freestanding thing that holds hot coals for either tableside cooking, in-room heating, or something for ceremonial purposes, depending on your time and place. In its original form, when it jumped from French to English in the 18th century, it referred originally to another two-part cooking method. The first part was sort of pre-cooking, giving your food a little fry, and then the second part was stewing the food in a limited amount of water. The cooking method braise and the object brazier are both tied to the French word for ember, which is braise. There's also the French verb braiser, which refers to cooking at lower temperatures using embers or wood coals around an enclosed vessel. Something like our bake kettle or the modern Dutch oven. And both words came into use in the English language, or at least in written English, in the 18th century, when, coincidentally, a bunch of French people were finding things a little too hot in their home country, and so they came to England and got involved in the food trade. That's right, the fashion of French cooks in grand English kitchens really got its start at this point. And so that gave the English a good 2 centuries or so of griping about the French cook mucking up good plain English cooking with all their sauces. And yes, sauce is also a French word. Gravy, for what it's worth, seems to have much more English roots, popping up in English writing in the 14th century. And all this means, where we are in the 19th century, gravy is proper, but sauce, especially the French ones with more than 2 ingredients, are fancy, fussy, and viewed with suspicion. I mean, tarragon, who uses that? So stew, back to that. Stew is old, but the word is new. How does that work? How can stew possibly be an 18th century word? I mean, I was using the word to describe 17th century food back at the start of the podcast. I even used a quip on stew from the book form of my favorite movie, The Princess Bride, way back in the very first episode. So, unsurprisingly, some concept of stew has been around since there have been pots. And pots have been with us since before pottery, those animal bladders and skin bags and large clamshells and such. But the things it got called, well, that has definitely changed with time and place. So in order not to get too lost, let's stick with our timeline. If the 17th century colonists were not calling their food cooked in pots and cauldrons stew, what were they calling it? Because when you look at any 17th century English language cooking materials, the word stew is nowhere to be found. So English language cookery is all England at this point. There's no America, there's no Britain. The Acts of Union hooking Scotland and England together don't even happen till 1707, right at the start of the 18th century. So the things that become stew began as dishes hung about with all these other words: fricondo, haricot, haricot, fricassee, olla, olla podrida, hodgepodge, ragu, daube, and so on. And all of these varying recipes seem to hail from areas that would eventually become the nations of France, Italy, Spain, and the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium. And along with all those sources and others were collapsed into this larger category of stew. Now, back in my second season, I mentioned almost all of those dishes. They were all regularly cooked in fireplaces and not on stoves. And depending on the fanciness of the preparation, it might involve the use of a second cooking vessel like a spider, that long-handled frying pan, or a saucepan as part of the preparation. But regardless of the name, these dishes, as they were finished up, looked an awful lot like stew. In fact, as time goes on, during the 18th century and on into the 19th, the instruction, stew your meat, or stew the chicken, or remove the meat from the stew, start to appear in the instructions for a ragu or a haricot or a daube. And they all have one thing in common that consistently differentiates them from soups. The liquid they're made with is water, and just enough water to cover the ingredients. In these European-based stewing methods, the assumption was that the meat or bird was going to cook in the water, and the water would take up flavorings from the things being cooked in it. A few seasonings might be added at the start, a strewing of salt, a chopped onion, and if one were fine and fancy, maybe a few corns of pepper, a clove or two, or perhaps a leaf of bay. But you knew you were near the end once the meat could be pierced easily with a fork. That's the source of the phrase fork tender, by the way. And as you approach the end, you could also add an assortment of fresh beans, leaves, young tender squash, or whatever might be foraged or fresh in the kitchen garden. But without fail, the meat or meats of choice in all these dishes were cooked in a limited amount of water, which in turn was flavored by the meat. As a result, these methods were most often used for the cuts of meat not typically roasted. This meant all those parts that were largely bones and sinew with a bit of meat hanging on. Stuff like trotters, shins, necks, breastbones, tails, knuckles, backbones, and just the bones larger cuts had been removed from. It was also a great way to cook up a mess of birds. Removing the craw, that is the digestive tract, and the feathers was already enough trouble. Butchering anything smaller than a large duck was just nonsense effort, but throwing them in a stew pot, now that made sense. So at its essence, what made a stew, or all those other dishes, the hodgepodge, the fricando, the olla, was that they were stewed. Water was used as a cooking medium to extract flavor from meats and create a rich liquid they could be eaten with. Okay, so just like baked beans were in fact baked when they were named, all these meat dishes were cooked in a manner that came to be called stewed. So what makes soup not a stew? Is it just adding more water, more liquid? Well, it turns out no, but also sometimes yes. So first of all, while the word stew is a fairly new word, soup is much older. And the concepts that coalesced into the modern word soup may have actually arrived in England twice by two different roots. There's pretty good agreement that the idea of soup comes from the Proto-Germanic word and concept sup, which connotes soaking up a flavorful liquid with a bread-type object. The word and the way of eating is found all throughout Saxon cultures, including the Danes that occupied large portions of England. The Saxons also crossed paths with the Romans, and they picked up the word as well, laundered it through numerous kitchens and cultures until the French noun soup also arrived on English shores sometime in the 17th century. Before that, what many of us would pull up to and call a soup had been named a broth or maybe a pottage. In fact, every pottage required a broth to begin, all the way back to our 14th century Proto-English cookbook, The Form of Curry. In fact, it would not be out of place to mention that one supped on a pottage or broth. It was just an older way of saying, I ate some soup. Just like with stew, soup started as a verb and became a thing, a noun, the noun soup. In fact, the supper meal for many people, when dinner was the big middle-of-the-day meal, The last meal of the day was often a broth with this and that from dinner heated in it, to be sopped up by toasted bits of bread called sippets and supped upon. So all of these precursors to supper and soup are at last making sense of why, when the last meal of the day is ready, some of us still call out, "Soup's on!" And the important defining characteristic of all of these soups and their precursors was that the liquid of the soup was flavorful to start with. Sure, you may seethe or simmer or even stew things in water to make that broth or sauce, but to make a soup, you always start with a broth, unless it's certain kinds of vegetable soups where the vegetable mashes or purees well, or simply exudes plenty of flavorful juices. So like potatoes, both kinds, squash, onions, and eventually tomatoes, these can be made into the flavorful central liquid of the soup. And the soup itself can be served at a number of temperatures. There are, of course, the hot soups, many of them clear, but plenty are thickened with a flour roux or oil, like in bouillabaisse. They may be served at room temperature, like bouillon, or it may even be chilled, like all manner of fruit soups, and of course the infamous or famous vichyssoise. Yes, I know it's a fairly modern dish, but it has roots in other things. But let's stay on course here. But once that base liquid is made, soups generally come together quite quickly. Usually the cooking, not counting the time to make the flavorful soup base, takes less than an hour. It's fabulously confusing, therefore, that more than one soup recipe has the cook stewing something to make soup. So, in the end, I'm willing to say, here in our modern times, whether it's a soup or a stew depends on what you choose to say. I mean, really, you're choosing the word to convey an idea to people. But back in the 19th century, there was an important and definite difference. The name was a clue to the cook, how long this was going to take. And it was also a clue to the diner. A stew implied it was the center of a meal, something hearty that might come with some side dishes, whereas a soup was something lighter, either just that last light meal of the day or part of a larger meal. The reflex so many of us have to say, "I'll just have a bowl of soup," is a bit of a legacy of this differentiation. With all the ways we have to cook things now, including plenty of ways to make broth that don't involve long cooking in our own kitchen, cause a fair number of stewed dishes to start with a liquid other than water. And for the same reason, a number of soups start with water. So in the end, here in the 21st century, call it what you want so people understand what you're saying. So that's solved. A much more important and useful set of questions now is what makes one of these stewed dishes, or what we might now call a braised dish, better, fancier, more tasty, and what keeps it from being an, stew. Nice. What useful tips can the 19th century hand us now that we reliably have running water and often air fryers? The first one is knowing the cooking time of your ingredients. Are they short cook or long cooking ingredients? Or if it can be either, what do you want out of those ingredients? Things that you want to flavor the sauce around the stew and don't mind them losing their own distinctive flavor. Into the pot they go, right at the start. Onions, potatoes, carrots, especially those not so sweet rainbow carrots, celery, both the stems and the root, parsnips, dried herbs are all great things to go into the pot at the start. Soaked or dried beans and starchy green peas also belong there. Second, do a little pre-cooking of your meat and even some of the vegetables before you really get to the stewing. A quick pan fry, even just in the bottom of your big stew pot, will add some extra flavors to the mix. And when we are making stew, especially the kind where we want it to start early, possibly in a crock pot, pre-cooking these things can seem like too much work. Another step. And yet, this pre-cooking was the key to making these stews richer, more complex, and impressive. A quick browning of the surface of the meat to be stewed brings a bunch of extra flavors. Depending on what you're going for, cooking down some of the onion to brown it also creates some nice extra flavors. We know now what chemistry is happening here, but back then they just knew that this step would make everything just a bit better, especially when you are working with a limited spice cabinet. So that means if you're thinking about making a stew, the low-effort version where you just throw it all in at the beginning, there's actually some good news. You can do that pre-cooking the night before, the day before. The browned flavors aren't gonna go away. I mean, the air fryer can help you with that. And that little extra effort up front makes the hours you're about to put into this food, one way or another, more worth it. Also, if you're planning on adding some dry spices, if you heat them up in the bottom of the pot over some high heat before you add in all the liquids, this will also create more intense and more varied flavors. I know paprika seems like the world's most boring spice, but if it's heated up while you're browning your meat in a little fat before you really get into the stewing, it actually has more to offer than you ever thought possible. That whole spice cooking step at the start of all those Indian curry recipes, they know what they're doing. The Western world sort of forgot, or our drastic changes in how our kitchens worked caused a few things to get lost. Anyway, stew recipes in cookbooks. So, because they're in cookbooks, they're the fanciest recipes. They have a step at the start where at least some of the ingredients of the stew are cooked a little bit over a quicker, that is hotter fire, before the majority of the liquid is added. They are developing flavors and creating a concentrated base for the stew before the long-term cooking in most of the water begins. Now, the last thing many of these stews do is have some things that go in at or near the end. Sometimes it's an enrichment with an egg or with butter or cream, or that very common butter the size of an egg rolled in flour. Sometimes wine is added, especially sweet wines like Madeira or Sack are added near the end. And oftentimes leafy or other fresh vegetables, turnips cut up if they're large, small summer squashes, lettuces, cut cabbage, fresh shelled beans are added at the point when they will be cooked until just done. Oh, and if it was a fish stew, the stew part was cooked for a long time, but the fresh fish, whether shellfish, shrimps, crabs, lobsters, finfish, those were added at the end, just until they were finished. The only exception in the fish stew category was salt cod. Once it was soaked and partially desalted, that went in at the start. It needed a lot of cooking. Now, the recipes these steps are found in themselves are minimal and abbreviated. Clearly, writing out the steps of pre-cooking and instructing when the additions go in at the end shows that they mattered to these stewed dishes, whatever name they were going by at this point. In this age of still pricey paper and books, these steps were written down. Recipes I'm looking at here in the early 19th century are still notes from one knowledgeable cook to another. They are not full instructions. There are a large number of missing steps. I mean, while we've moved on from the 17th century admonition of when it is enough for judging doneness, the instructions in the 19th century recipes are still really limited. Cooking was still a profession. Almost everyone who cooked mostly learned from someone else in their kitchen. And if the person you learned from didn't do certain things or ran out of time to teach you stuff, well, there weren't a lot of other places to learn, except maybe from another cook, if they had time. And so as people spread out over the expanding America, and it was expanding, from 1800 to 1850, 15 more states were added. And this meant more people were heading out to the wild frontier with minimal tools, minimal experience, and completely unrealistic ideas about how dinner got made. So most of them had no idea how a good stew was made. If anything, this period does more to turn us into the steak and potatoes nation we became and ruined our relationship with stew. But all is not lost. Before the scattering really got going, many cooks left a bunch of notes, and cooks who never went anywhere made more notes. So it's time to crib from them and start making better stews at home, even in the crock pots and the multi-cookers and on our induction stovetops. So between these 19th century tips and my etymological wanderings, you can now explain the differences between soup and stew, if you care. and how really in the end the cook gets to choose what to call it. But before we end, what about those canned beans? Are they a stew? Well, it's again up to you. But yes, in a technical sense, because those beans are cooked in a fairly small amount of liquid in a hot enclosure, they have definitely been stewed. Now next week, I will finally get down to what the regional stews, and a few soups if I'm going to stick with my own designations and grace, are developing into. Different growing regions, different populations, different living conditions, different life expectancies and residency expectations led to a wide variety of stew types to develop around this rapidly expanding country. And make note, as some of these preferences will go on to influence the early canned goods industry, and some of them we live with today. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Thank you again for your new reviews. Your thoughtful comments are so nice to read, because after all, it's still just me back here. Let more people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. And as I'm in my 4th season and have gone to this every other week schedule, I will be dropping some other interesting stuff into my feed beyond the crossover episodes, including an upcoming bonus episode on my newest fascination, Romania, after my short visit. So November 19th has come and gone, so the debut of the documentary Women's Work has happened on KBTC in the Pacific Northwest, but it will be coming out around the country. I'll keep you updated. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Blue Sky, and Insta, and occasionally elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.